Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. Hollywood is known for making miracles, and just now, one of its slyest efforts is on display at a screen near you. The Big Short deftly pulls off the trick, in the words of The New Yorker, of being a feel-good film about doom, the global financial crisis of 2008.
When the banks committed the greatest fraud in U.S. history,
no one is paying attention.
It's unbelievable.
4 outsiders risked it all to take them down.
We're going to make the big banks hurt.
How can the banks let this happen? It's fueled by stupidity.
But that's not stupidity, that's fraud.
Tell me the difference between stupid and illegal, and I'll have my wife's brother arrested.
Are we better off now than we were 8 years ago? We are fortunate to have a guest who can tell us. He is the nonpareil financial writer and editor Mike Candell. You'll meet him next. Delighted to welcome to our program Mike Candell. And Mike, before we get into the real business here, your name on the screen people will see as Myron, which is your real name. Most people call you Mike. You're okay with that?
I'm very good. Can I call you Tony?
You sure? Where did that come from, by the way?
When I was in college, my friends on the college paper used to call me Mike, and it sort of stuck with me ever since. My wife and family call me Mike.
All right. We showed a clip from The Big Short, book based on a book by Michael Lewis. In case some people still don't understand what happened back there, what the banks and the mortgage companies were doing and nearly brought down the economy. In a thumbnail, can you explain it?
Well, what happened, Tony, was a combination of greed and stupidity. And sometimes the same person did both.
Right.
And the fact is, the idea of securitizing mortgages, you put them in a bunch together, so some bad mortgages may be there, but most of them are good, and then you have more money to loan out to people who want to buy homes. Good idea. But the banks, or the investment banks particularly, in their greed, began developing all kinds of chicanery that instead of having just a smattering of bad loans in the mixture, they had, in many cases, all bad loans, but they didn't identify them that way, and they passed them off to unsuspecting investors, and not individuals, but other banks and insurance companies and mutual funds and so on.
And nearly brought down the economy.
Absolutely. And not only that, but really, which always still bugs me to this day, the millions of unsuspecting homeowners that got caught up in this frenzy. Now, some of them were greedy. They took out loans they knew they couldn't pay. But who gave them those loans?
The mortgage companies and the banks. Right. And the mortgage companies then sold these bad mortgages to the banks. Banks, as you say, packaged them all up nice in packages and put fancy names on them like CDO and other things, and sold those.
And the rating companies.
And the rating companies.
They gave them good ratings, so these unsuspecting investors, institutional investors, figured, well, if the rating companies, who are supposed to do their homework on this stuff, put a good mark on them, it's okay for us to buy.
Right.
So there's a lot of blame to go around, and you know what, Tony? Nobody went to jail.
One guy from UBS, and I think in Europe, one banker, went to jail. No American bank or banker went to jail. I mean, even today, we're 8 years on, I still wonder. The top executives of the banks didn't see what was going on. The Fed didn't see what was going on. Alan Greenspan didn't see what was going on. How is that possible?
And the media.
And the media.
The media had occasional stories, but they didn't follow through on them. Can I tell you my own personal responsibility? I really feel responsible. When I was financial editor of CNN, had the pleasure of working with you, One of our young people came to me one day and said a friend of his got a mortgage, and the mortgage was 125% of the value of the home. And I said, that's ridiculous. What bank would give you 125% of the sale price of the home? You better go back and check. And the young man at CNN went back and checked, and he said, that's what my friend got. I said, that's ridiculous. Now, if I was smarter, I would have said, wow, what's going on here? And it turns out it was going on all over the country because home prices were going up so fast that they figured if we give you 125% next year,
It'll be worth it.
It'll be worth it.
Well, I take your point that the media could have done a better job. But let's get back to the reality here. We depend on regulators, the Treasury people, the Fed, to regulate, to catch this stuff. How explain that? That Alan Greenspan was out there almost all the time, repeatedly saying the housing market is not a bubble.
Well, I think these things were so complicated that even the regulators, but worse than the regulators, the bank presidents, the CEOs of the banking companies didn't even understand the risk that was implicit in what they owned. They didn't understand it. And these guys were getting tens of millions of dollars in salary and perks and options.
The movie puts us in the difficult position of in effect, rooting for some oddballs who did see what was going on and bet against it, the short. So you're in a position of rooting for guys who are basically betting on the economy to fail. And I have to say, the movie does a good job of us wanting them to
be right.
To be right, and they make a lot of money.
But these were only a few really outliers.
They were outliers.
The rest of Wall Street was scoffing at them and say, you're ridiculous. Look, everything's going up. Why are you crying wolf? Well, it turned out wolf was the right word.
Even now, 8 years on, what should have happened? Shouldn't somebody have paid, with a criminal accusation in trials and perhaps go to prison?
Well, I think the reason there haven't been there haven't been many at all criminal prosecutions is it's very difficult to prosecute greed and stupidity, right? You have to prove outright fraud, and fraud was involved, but it was very difficult for the government to prove that, and therefore they didn't bring the cases that some of us think they should have.
Are we better off?
We are better off, but not enough. We do have something called Dodd-Frank, which the Congress passed against Wall Street. Wall Street has an inordinate amount of influence in Congress. Tremendous lobbying. They spend huge amounts of money. They make big speeches about how upright they are, and then they tell their lobbyists to get rid of all the aspects of the bill that would really curtail their efforts. We've done some of it. Some of it is good, but not enough. And I hate to say this, but I think we're going to have another bubble, one way or another.
Well, the movie ends on a note on the screen just before the credits roll, and then I checked this in Google this, and their stories have been in the press. Right, in terms of what you're worried about, perhaps another bubble. Goldman Sachs is now marketing something called a bespoke tranche opportunity. I don't even know if that's English, but what it sounds like, and what Bloomberg News called it, is just another name for one of these fancy investment things that got us in trouble 8 years ago.
Well,
and they're marketing it now.
That's the big argument against unfettered investment activity. That's why we need regulators. We need legislation. Don't forget, going into that crisis, we were in a period of less regulation.
Right.
Under a Republican administration, okay? I think we need tight regulation and we need smarter regulation. And one of the problems, by the way, in the regulatory process is these guys, good people, young lawyers and others. They come to work for government, and then they go through the revolving door, and they end up working for the same people they were regulating previously.
Exactly.
And so is there a bias there? Let's face it, of course.
Let's go back to your roots. You grew up in Brooklyn. Were you always intent on being a journalist?
I wanted to be a journalist ever since I was in high school, Erasmus Hall High School in the heart of Flatbush, Brooklyn. I was sports editor of the Erasmus Hall paper. Then I went to Brooklyn College, great education there, became sports editor of that newspaper. By the way, a very authoritarian college administration kicked our newspaper off campus.
Really? Why?
Yeah.
What did
I mean,
you
it's
do?
a long story.
All right.
And many of us went on to do good things in journalism and government and elsewhere. But that, I caught the bug. And while I was still a senior at Brooklyn College, I got a job as a copy boy in the New York Times, working at night and finishing school during the day.
For someone with the ambition you had, that must have been just glorious. Those must have been glorious days. You discovered, and I love this story. I mean, I find it hard to conjure with, but that anyone on the staff, you're a copy boy, anybody on the staff of the New York Times could write an editorial.
Right. In those days, the editorial page, the Times was 8 columns.
Right.
Now it's less. And the editorial page had 5 columns of editorials. And in order to fill out the page, there were some less consequential editorials. And so any member of the staff could contribute. So when I heard this, I said, wow, I could write an editorial for the New York Times. I spent 3 nights working, after I finished my shift, working on writing an editorial on how to end the Korean War.
Wow.
Some reason they did not pick my editorial.
Imagine that oversight.
They didn't.
What was the Kandel, if you can remember, what was the Kandel prescription for ending the Korean War?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that, but I forgot.
Okay.
But whatever it was, they didn't think Copy Boy Kandel was the guy to do it.
So then I forth on that subject.
Yeah.
No.
So then I set my sights a little lower, and I wrote another editorial that said, "Give blood." I was in
Okay.
favor of that.
You were in favor of that.
Right.
Good.
And then during that summer, I wrote 2 more editorials. One was Support UNESCO, and the other one was the Brooklyn Botanical Garden. So now I had 3 editorials
Published.
in the New York Times. By the way, I was making $27 a week, and you got $15 for writing an editorial.
Wow.
Okay,
What a
so that was pretty good.
What a bonus.
Now, I'd meet my friends from the college paper on the subway or elsewhere, and they say, where are you working? New York Times. You doing any writing? Well, I've written some editorials. Nobody believed me. So I stopped telling.
And you had no proof because, of course, the editorials are not
byline.
signed. Oh, that's marvelous. I don't want to jump ahead too quickly, but you went on to become financial editor of 3 newspapers in New York. I think the last was the Post.
Yeah, the Washington Star was a fine newspaper in those days. Then the New York Herald Tribune, an even finer newspaper, maybe one of the best newspapers ever published. I went down with the ship, 1966. And then when Rupert Murdoch, and a couple of other things in between, when Rupert Murdoch bought the New York Post, he hired me to be financial editor.
Why finance? How did that develop as your area of expertise? Well, area of interest and then expertise.
Total accident, Tony. After Brooklyn College, I went to Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. And when I got out of there, they made me a copy editor trainee, and then eventually copy editor, who edits reporters' copy, writes the headlines. And I did that. I loved it, but I was the youngest copy editor at the time at the Times, and I wanted to be a reporter and get out in the street. And the city editor, who was my boss, said it's harder to get good copy editors than good reporters.
Really?
A sort of left-handed compliment.
Yeah.
He didn't give me any more money. But I really did a lot of writing on the side. And finally, a friend of mine said there were 3 openings in the financial department all at once. And I went to the city editor. I said, look, the financial editor got 3 openings to fill. Why don't you let me go and fill one of those?
Well,
And I learned. That's the point. I knew nothing about finance, but I learned.
and you learned well enough to be present at the founding of CNN. You were the you are the founding financial editor of CNN, which is a kind of mouthful way of saying you were there at the beginning, and they said, Mike, create us a financial department, financial reporting side to this new effort.
Well, we really pioneered the coverage of business news on network television. Previously, as a newspaper man, I would lecture sometimes to groups of publishers and editors, and I said business news is the wasteland of television news. So we in the newspaper business can prosper by covering business news, okay? When I got to CNN, I didn't say that anymore, but we were able to do it. And the first time on network television that we had programs specifically devoted to business news. At one time, during my 25 years at CNN, at one time we had 1/4 of the entire 24-hour news day,
Cycle, yeah.
Weekdays, 1/4, 6 hours was devoted to business news, and now hardly any.
Well, I want to come back to now in a minute, but what was that like at the beginning? I mean, you must have met with Ted Turner. He must have outlined a view of what he thought this thing could be. What was he saying?
Well, it was really Reese Schoenfeld, who was the first president of CNN, who hired me and put together the staff and whatever. And when I told him that, when I first met him, I had no idea of going into television. And I said, I hope you're going to do something with business news in this 24-hour network. He said, oh, yes, we're going to do a whole half hour at a good time period, 7 p.m. Eastern. And then he eventually offered me the job, and we developed the department and so on. We had some good people there, and we really pioneered it. What was interesting, the first review of CNN that appeared in TV Guide, which was a very important magazine at that point, cited us, the business news department, was critical of other elements of the network, but cited the business news department as one of the outstanding features.
Well, you were present for and helped create, or maybe singly created, Moneyline, which was, I don't know if CNN still runs it, but it is extraordinarily well reported, well presented half hour in the evening business program, and won all sorts of awards over the years.
Well, the reason I used to use the word the real wasteland of television news, meaning business, was each of the networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, had a financial economic correspondent, good people, but they could barely get on the air.
You're right.
And only if something really major happened, but they were lucky to get on the air 2 or 3 times a week. Right,
Sure.
And we did a whole half hour.
Every night.
Yeah.
At competing with their evening news, by
Yeah.
the way, at the same time. I wonder if you thought at this time, you're pretty successful now. You've been the financial editor of the Trib and the Post and other newspapers, Washington Star, and you're established. And here comes this opportunity. And it's no surprise to you that the rest of us in this business, in television, we're looking at this thing, CNN, in 1980 and saying, are you kidding me? 24 hours of news, round the clock, on cable? Never work, not going to happen. Of course, it shows
frankly,
what foresight we had. Do you have any second thoughts?
I was financial editor of the Post, and when Murdoch hired me, he said to me, we're going to put out a quality tabloid. And that's the reason I came. And I got to tell you, nearly 3 years I was at the New York Post, Murdoch never interfered with anything I did. I ran it. They gave me pretty well free rein and so on. We built up the staff. We got more space and whatever. The rest of the paper, particularly the front of the paper, began getting more and more sensational. And I was getting fed up with that. I tried to convince Murdoch to to go more high scale as he originally said he would do. And circulation kept going up, so he didn't go in that direction. I was ready to leave when I accidentally, through a mutual friend, met Reese Schoenfeld, who was putting together CNN. And when he gave me the word that he was going to do quality news coverage of business and finance,
That was enough for you.
that was enough for me.
And the rest is history, as they say. And you know, people like me and so many others look like idiots for thinking, "Oh, this thing can't work."
And we got you eventually, right?
Yes, you did get me eventually, and tried to teach me from the business news. And I applaud your efforts. They didn't exactly take, but I applaud your efforts. What do you think of CNN today?
Well, I'm really disappointed that CNN a while ago virtually abandoned its coverage of business news. And there just aren't any dedicated programs. A couple of good people still there. CNN International, by the way, does a better job of covering business and financial news than CNN Domestic does. The feeling is, okay, so one of the guys that ran CNN didn't care about business news. That was that. And that was ironic because it was right in the teeth of the whole fiasco and when business news became the top story of our time, right?
Exactly.
When the economic collapse was on the way. But at any rate, and now the emphasis is on ratings. And you well know, being a TV veteran, that ratings the name of the game. And even though CNN used to get more money for its advertising on the business news programs because it got a better quality viewer, it doesn't get big ratings.
Better demographic.
Right.
Its reporting generally seems to have suffered too, but
Very good people there, by the way.
There are many good people.
Terrific, and they do. Listen, when there's a big story, where do we turn? We turn to the viewers, where do they turn? They turn to CNN.
Fox News too, and we're not here to debate the cable television news world. I noticed in your background that for a time you were a correspondent in Bonn, covering Europe and from a business point of view, but also from
Germany and the common market.
Germany and the common market. The Times Sunday magazine, the cover story was the EU. Has Europe reached the breaking point? I know it's a long time since you've been covering the EU, but what do you think about what's going on with that debt crisis and the refugee crisis? And
well, by the way, when I was doing it, was called the Common Market, and there were 6 nations. You know, there was Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. That was it. Yeah. And now, I don't even remember how many nations there are now in the EU and so on. And like any big organization, it's suffering strains. And this refugee crisis just brings it all to a head. But even before that, Europe suffered from the global malaise that we talked about earlier.
Sure.
Okay, and there was a big discussion: do we do austerity? Do we try to prime the pump and pick up the economies? And a lot of those economies in Europe are still in bad shape. Okay, ours has recovered, slower than it should have, perhaps, but it has recovered, and many of the others have not yet recovered. So the EU is under strain. Germany is the big, the 600-pound gorilla because it is so profitable and so on. And Germany has done pretty well as far as accepting refugees.
it has.
But this is one of the, this is an existential problem of these millions of poor people from particularly Syria, but other places as well, fleeing to try to get a better life for themselves and their children. And by the way, there are people in this country who say, don't let them in.
Well, we've heard that during the presidential race, such as it is so far, with several candidates trying to top each other, saying nobody's coming into my state, and we're not taking anybody. And Donald Trump has a slogan, "Make America Great Again." And you could argue, if you listen to the stuff he says, that the slogan really ought to be "Make America Un-American."
Well, okay, I won't disagree with you on that, but I think America is great. It has real problems, The real problem is the amount of poverty we have, and the inequality, economic inequality, is a problem. But even more than that is the erosion of the middle class. The middle class is what made this country so prosperous after World War II and beyond, right? And the middle class has not kept pace with the growth of the economy. The people at the very top have benefited the most. So a lot of people, Bernie Sanders particularly, and others have said, we have to do better by the middle class.
What I meant by that, make America un-American, I mean, Trump has talked, he has insulted Muslims. He has insulted the refugees. He is so xenophobic in a country that, there's a statue standing in the harbor that says, bring me your poor and your
huddled masses.
Huddled masses.
And by the way, our ancestors were among those huddled masses, right? That's really the pity. What made this country so great were immigrants going way back. I mean, we were all immigrants except for the Native Americans, right? But many of us much more recent immigrants and descendants of those immigrants. And that really, I think, that's what really made this country as great as it is. And the idea of keeping out new people, fresh blood, is anathema to the American way.
Exactly. In a short time, and maybe it's not fair to ask you to do that, but you talked about the problems of the middle class, and they're well known. Do you hear any prescriptives in this presidential race so far that make any sense to you?
Well, I'm disappointed. I really am. I mean, we've heard mostly from the Republicans, occasional Democratic debate, and so on. Nobody has come up with a real program, certainly on the Republican side, a real program that would, when Trump says make America great again, he doesn't have a program to do that except a lot of hyperbole and so on. And I think that's the sad part. But let me tell you my pet peeve, may I?
Your pet peeve.
My pet peeve is how the media glorified Donald Trump. And I think our friends and former colleagues in the media went overboard. I saw a study recently that showed...
But don't you think there has been a lot of courage, but don't you think a lot of it has been critical of him?
Oh, yes, it's critical, but so much, they devoted so much time to him. And, there's something like name recognition, right? You can't turn on a TV, anything to do with news, and now even the entertainment programs have Donald Trump interminably. Now, why? Going back to what we talked about, ratings.
Ratings.
Donald Trump gets ratings.
There is so much more to talk about, and I guess what we do is we got to have you back here. But this has been a delight. Mike Candel, it's just terrific to have you here.
Thank you, Tony. My pleasure.
We will see you next week.